Hi, everyone, and welcome to ethics. So what is ethics? Well, the short answer is that ethics is the study of right and wrong. This isn't simply studying people's opinions about things. For example, this isn't studying what percentage of people in culture A think about abortion, the issue of abortion compared to culture B. That's a very interesting question, but that's more of a sociological question, not a philosophical one. In philosophy, we're interested in what is truly right or wrong, or what makes something right or wrong. And so you might think, wait a second, isn't ethics or right and wrong just a matter of opinion? Well, that brings us to our reading today. And this comes from the online textbook here. I'm going to go ahead and work through this chapter, highlight some main points, and give you my thoughts and explanations of them. So this is chapter 1, written by Paul Rezkalla, and the title of this chapter is Aren't Right and Wrong Just Matters of Opinion? So the chapter starts off with a case study or an issue. This is a social or cultural practice called sati in pre-19th century India. And this was the practice of burning a widow on her husband's funeral pyre when he died. And when the British colonialists came in, they found this practice morally problematic, to say the least, and they outlawed it. They said this is no longer allowed. And as far as I know, it no longer happens these days. So this sets the stage for this question of whether or not moral relativism is true or cultural relativism is true. So let's first define cultural or moral relativism. That's just the view that says that right and wrong depend on a certain perspective or one's culture. And so this question is discussed or explored in a branch of philosophy called metaethics. And here's a quote from the author. Metaethics is the branch of ethics that deals with the nature of morality. It tries to answer the questions, what is morality? Is morality objective? Where does it come from? What is the relationship between moral facts, if they exist, and this physical world that we interact with? And so before we figure out how we ought to be and live, we must first establish whether there even is such a thing as the way we ought to be and live in the first place. So after this, Rezkalla discusses the distinction between realism and anti-realism, and he defines moral realism here. Moral realism is the, quote, position that there are mind-independent facts about ethics that are true and binding, even if we have beliefs to the contrary. So that means that there's some objective truth to these things, independent of how I think about them or you think about them. In other words, there are right answers to these questions. On the other hand, moral anti-realism is simply the negation of this thesis, he says, quote, for the anti-realist, there are no mind-independent facts about morality. Morality can be constructed or is merely relative to culture, end quote. So those are our definitions. Moral anti-realism is basically a type of moral relativism or cultural relativism. We should also distinguish cultural relativism from subjectivism. In the title of the article, the author says this is about subjectivism as well, which is just the view that right and wrong depend on my own opinion, subjective to me, and so that there is no truth beyond what I think is true. So let's look at the different types of relativism here. The author says, quote, in discussing descriptive relativism, he says, according to descriptive relativism, moralities and ethical codes are radically different across cultures. So this is really just a sociological fact. There's not much debate here, right? Different people believe different things about different things. So for example, widow burning in pre-19th century India, people believed different things at that time. Different cultures believe different things on how you should treat people. And so that's just a fact that things were or are different across cultures. So it's not really stating anything very controversial. But metaethical relativism is different. Quote, metaethical relativism says that moral truths are actually only true relative to specific groups of people. This means that whether a moral belief is true is dependent on or relative to the standpoint of the person or culture that has the belief. So this goes a step further than descriptive relativism, which just states a sociological fact. This is stating, in fact, a philosophical fact that there are no moral truths above or transcending one's culture. So next, let's go on to normative relativism. According to normative relativism, quote, no person or culture ought to judge the ethical codes of other cultures as being inferior, nor should any culture intervene in another culture to prevent it from carrying out the specifics of its ethical code, end quote. So the idea here is that how we should deal with this cultural or moral diversity is by not judging other cultures. In other words, we ought not to judge other cultures as being inferior to ours or seeing ours as better than theirs. And so that we'll see soon enough seems to be a moral code, right? That is more than just a moral code, or at least understood to be more than just a moral code for our culture. Does that undermine moral relativism? To me, it seems like it does, but we'll talk more about that in just a second. The problem of moral diversity is the following. Relativism seems, quote, to offer a better explanation of why there exists so much moral disagreement in the world, okay? So you've got this fact that there is moral diversity, that people disagree about things like widow burning in the history of humanity. So how do we explain that fact? Well, it's either moral realism or moral anti-realism. So if those are the only two options, how does the moral realist deal with the fact of moral diversity? The author says, quote, the moral realist who holds that there are objective truths about values has two possible responses available to the problem of moral disagreement. The first response is to question the scope and profundity of the moral disagreement between cultures. In other words, the idea is that maybe it just looks like on the surface, things are quite different between cultures, but underneath we find out that it's not a matter of moral disagreement. Really, it's just a matter of factual disagreement or disagreement on the facts. But if we all agreed on the facts, whether they're scientific or religious or whatever, we would also agree on the moral norms or values. The objectivist quote, here's another quote from the author, the objectivist second response to this problem of moral diversity is, quote, to question the main assumption made by the relativist when arguing from the problem of moral diversity. The relativist argument against moral objectivity comes in two steps. First, she assumes that if there were an objective morality, then there would not be such moral diversity. And second, she rejects moral objectivity because of the presence of moral diversity. But why should we grant this first assumption? Why should we assume that if morality is objective, people will not disagree? So people who are moral relativists often take moral diversity, the fact of moral diversity, to support their conclusion of moral relativism. But just because we have diversity of moral views, just because we have disagreement about things such as widow burning, doesn't mean there's not a right or correct moral answer to these questions. It just means that we've got disagreement. And he uses the examples in the example of a math class and students who don't fully understand or disagree about a quadratic equation. Just because there's disagreement in a math class doesn't mean there's not some right answer to the problem or the question, right? And so he's saying analogously, in the same way for morality, just because there's disagreement about what's morally correct doesn't mean there's no right answer to it. So at this point, the author turns his attention to objections to relativism. And what the author is doing here is trying to argue against this idea of moral relativism or cultural relativism. And I'll tell you that most ethicists, most professional philosophers today do take a stand, some type of stand against moral relativism. And in a class like ours in ethics, you almost need to make an assumption like this, that moral relativism is false. Otherwise, there's not really much more to talk about in terms of ethics and applying ethical theory to moral problems. So I'm just letting you know there's a point of view being expressed here, and that is against moral relativism. So the first objection to moral relativism is this question of relative to whom. And the author says, quote, one of the difficulties with moral relativism in general is answering the question of what a culture is or what counts as an appropriate body of people for morality to be relative to or dependent on. Is a village a large enough population to have its own valid ethical code? Or is morality only relative to national governments and the laws set by them, end quote. And so the idea is, if we're trying to identify what our moral code is, we have to identify it in reference to some community that we're a part of. But we're a part of lots of communities, our city, our county, our state, our country. And even within those, there are further lines to be drawn. So this makes it difficult, if not impossible, to identify our moral code. So that's an objection. I don't know how strong of an objection that is, but it is something that the moral relativist needs to consider. The second objection is that some things just seem wrong. And in this section, the author mentions this reductio ad absurdum. A reductio ad absurdum is a way of arguing where you assume your opponent's point of view to be true in order to disprove it. In other words, you take by hypothesis the claim that they're trying to make and show that it leads to some sort of contradiction or impossibility or absurdity. And that means that the hypothesis or the original claim must be false. So your author says, quote, if the consequences are sufficiently counterintuitive or ridiculous, then we are justified in rejecting the view as being false. And so that's the strategy that the author is about to use here. So the author says, quote, most people today think that it's really morally wrong to burn widows on funeral pyres, even though it was practiced by a large group of people at one point. The relativist position, however, this is the one who thinks that morality is truly relative. The relativist position, quote, commits her to conceding that even practices like sati, or female genital mutilation, or infanticide, or slavery are morally acceptable to the cultures that do not see them as immoral. And because the relativist denies that there are objective morals or values that hold universally, then there is no independent standard by which to evaluate behaviors and ethical codes. So I want you to understand this argument. Even if you don't agree with it, I want you to understand the force of it. What this author is saying, and in fact, I agree with him on this argument, is that if there are no objective moral values, then there is no way outside of one culture to say that something is right or wrong. So you can't say of another person's culture or their values over there, like the values of pre-19th century India and the practice of widow burning, you can't say that's wrong because there's no external, transcendent moral position from which to judge that, if moral relativism is true. But this is an argumentum ad absurdum, meaning that since that conclusion follows from that hypothesis, then that hypothesis must be false, because we all know that widow burning is a bad idea, right? Is wrong. And in many of these other examples, these are all wrong. So if the moral theory can't give us that, then the moral theory must have problems. So we should reject moral relativism. That's what the author's claiming here. The third objection is relativism and tolerance. So the author says, quote, if we acknowledge that no one culture's ethical code is superior to another, then our ability to practice tolerance naturally increases, for all moralities are equal. Relativism, it is argued, makes moral superiority unjustified. And tolerance is a good thing, right? We all should be tolerant. We should practice tolerance with other people, other views, and other cultures. And the concern here that's raised by the relativist is that the theory of moral relativism actually cultivates this tolerance better than anything else. But your author says, quote, by arguing that we should prefer relativism on the grounds that it better helps us promote and justify tolerance, then the relativist has conceded the existence of at least one universal value that all moralities can be judged by, namely tolerance. The presence of this universal value This objective fact about the way we ought to live and behave undercuts relativism itself, for it concedes that there is at least one value that is not relative. So in other words, if you're going to promote tolerance, you're going to think tolerance is a universal value, it sure does sound like an objective moral value, but your theory of moral relativism can't account for objective moral values. So you've got some explaining to do, right? Okay, so moving on to the next section. Final objection is that there's no room for social reform or progress. The author says, quote, one of the strongest objections to relativism is the idea that if relativism is true, then there can be no such thing as social reform or moral progress. And this is kind of like an argumentum, a reductio ad absurdum as well, because it's basically saying you agree that our culture gets better or can even get worse, right? I mean, you agree that he's assuming you agree that widow burning is a bad thing and that Indian culture has improved since they've gotten rid of that social practice. But that only makes sense. In other words, you can only make sense of social progress or moral improvement if there is some sort of objective or transcendent moral value or moral code that we're all trying to get closer to, we're all trying to improve, or all our cultures are moving towards. Even if you think that cultures aren't getting better, you're still like, you think that things are getting worse in the world, that seems to assume some kind of objective moral system by which you can judge things getting better or worse. And so I've got a quote there, you can read that. The basic idea is that moral relativism suffers from a number of serious flaws and should be rejected as an account of ethics, a serious theory of ethics. And the author ends at the very last part of the essay with this quote. I'll read it to you. We cringe when we recall the atrocities of American slavery, the Holocaust and the rape of Nanking. We see the wrongness of these atrocities like we see the rightness of 2 + 2 = 4. Relativism suffers from several major problems, and this should make us question its ability to explain the nature of morality. All right, I hope you found that helpful.